So, tonight, last week we had, there was like a brief discussion about like control spirits and kind of like an attitude of control, and it was in relation to like people just trying to salvage life and so on after trauma and other such instances of just destruction and wreckage. And I was really feeling led to go over this topic, talking specifically about controlling and religious spirits. Now, the reason why we're talking about both of them at the same time is that they are hand in hand very much. The truth is that I don't think there's a significant difference between the two because their priorities are very similar. And that is to put people in bondage on the basis of maintaining some form of control over their world. Whether it's by, in the case of what many would call religious spirits, is by proving themselves valuable to their respective God, as it were. Because religious spirits aren't just Christian. I've known pagans and witches and Muslims and Buddhists and so many different other people in other religions. I've known people who didn't even worship anything, and they still had what one would call a religious spirit. It was really just about their morals, their moral convictions, and control around that. So it's not just the religiousness of it is being dedicated to those views and perspectives. I've known at least one or two atheists who had religious spirits, if you want to call it that, as much as they might like be offended at the idea. But the thing about it is that it's purely looking at this concept, this tendency or identity, I guess, of being so dedicated to their own moral code and proving themselves by it, and finding their value and dictating their value to those around them through it. And in that, they control their value, they control their worth, and they can prove their worth to themselves and to everyone else, kind of. And if they are religious in nature, then they're proving it before their God. And that adds a whole other kind of dynamic to it. Likewise, control spirits focus on something similar, and that is, again, finding value and creating it, and through the efforts of one's own being. So, to be more concise, those who have religious spirits try to glean their value or whatever through acts of worship. Those who have controlling spirits try to do the same thing through acts. Again, what those acts look like can vary significantly, but it is nevertheless through action, finding worth through proof, by proving it. And it's a very, very easy thing to slip up on, to fall into. Because the reality is that these kinds of spirits are like spiders, in that they wait for us to fall into the webs of whatever calamity is there, and then they spring out. They inject us with an idea of how to make life better or how to make ourselves or our lives better, and then they wrap us in it. And once we're all wrapped up and constricted, that's when they feed. And the thing about it is that, like, we see examples of this and what this causes all the time. Like if you go into church and throw a rock, you're probably going to hit somebody who has some kind of issue relating to this. And part of the reason why we're talking about them in the same breath is because there are a lot of people who have control issues who will walk into church and God becomes their means of controlling their life. They think, if I can make myself good enough for God, if I can gain enough righteousness, then he will give me the control that I need and want. He will make life what I want it to be, what I need it to be. And that want and need dynamic is a very, very important thing to consider, because at the core of it, most of us want control. But it feels like a need. When things are so catastrophic that there's nothing we can do, we feel the need to put our hands on the wheel, to control something, to hold it all together, to pick up the pieces and build it again. And that may not necessarily be what is supposed to happen. But, we'll get to that in a little bit. So just to kind of define the two and why we're talking about them together, that's kind of the gist of it, if it were, or as it were. And the thing about it is, though, is that we need to be able to discern what it looks like to be righteous, what it looks like to be good, as opposed to what it feels like to be righteous and to be good. See, we've spent a lot of time in this group. In the years that Refuge has existed as a small church, identity has been one of our primary discussion points. Who you are in Jesus is what makes you, right? And we've spent so many years on this, talking about this. At times it feels like, just throwing up the same things over and over again. But the reason being is that it's so important. And a lot of people don't value it. It's kind of like rest. Rest is one of the greatest gifts that God has given us, and none of us do it. It's important. It's commanded. It was dictated that, or it was commanded that we would take a day during the week to rest, and we don't do that so much. Nobody these days has a Sabbath day. It's just all hustle. Yeah. In the same vein, though, identity is an incredibly important part of our day-to-day life. Who we are and who we believe we are will oftentimes define our relationship with God. And it's sad in a way. It almost feels narcissistic at times. But it is the way it is, because if we can't see the value in ourselves, we don't trust God. And that's not an accusatory statement. It's a point of reference to the way that when we're being told, when God's saying you are worth everything to me, if we can't see that, we'll oftentimes rebuff that statement. We'll either dismiss it, we'll accept it in the same kind of passing way where we say, the same way as when our moms tell us they love us or something like that. Or I guess a better example is when your mom tells you that you're handsome. I know whenever my mom would tell me that, it was like, yeah, well, you're required to say that, because otherwise it's a reflection on you. You made this. So, unfortunately, a big portion of who we are can oftentimes be lost in these points of calamity. And that's when we start trying to take control. It's not just that, though. Sometimes it's not even calamity that drives it. See, the need for control or the desire for it can come about for a lot of different reasons. Those who had particularly chaotic lives or upbringings, or just sometimes even people who had very strict upbringings and were completely unchaotic. In both instances, you can find people who struggle with control because the people who come from a chaotic background, they feel they need it. They feel that they need to acquire it. So they'll fight and bite and try. And it's almost like it's a trap in a way, because they've never lived with it. They don't understand it. They only have ideas of how it works. It's like describing color to the blind, or trying to have somebody who grew up in a desert swim for the first time. It's not going to be pretty, and it's usually not going to work. And then when they're drowning, if they're prideful, they're not going to be able to acknowledge that they're drowning, and they're just going to keep trying. Whereas the people who grew up under absolute stricture, they have a problem in that they don't understand anything else. Everything has to be like in a row. You get people who have perfectionist mindsets and things like that because that's what they've been taught. And suddenly they now have to, any time that there's an opportunity to control the situation, they have to have it. I can think of mutual people who we know that spring right to mind who have that particular struggle, but especially like pastors' kids. Well, oftentimes there's always at least one in particular who really, really struggles with control, because everything has to be perfect. When you grow up under the constant scrutiny of an entire community, and if that scrutiny falls on you, if you give them a reason to scrutinize you, you give them a reason to scrutinize your entire family. And it's an unfortunate and very wrong-minded thing, but it is unfortunately a thing. So you'll get people who have this very people-pleasing, obsessive-compulsive kind of character, and it makes it really easy for these kinds of spirits to fall into, to kind of creep in there and twist that, take advantage of it. So, just so it's understood, we're not entirely piggybacking off of last week's message. This is its own thing. Very much its own thing. Its own mountain to climb. And the reason why it's important to understand, because a lot of people don't really see it as a bad thing that they have a kind of controlling nature. A lot of people who have it tend to like it. It feels comfortable. And in the end, a lot of us are comfort driven more than we are driven by what's true or important. So we'll oftentimes sacrifice truth for comfort. And if you go up to some people who have this kind of spirit, if you will, or even just this upbringing, they don't even have to be influenced at that point. It could just be how they were raised. And they'll tell you that they prefer it this way because it makes them a better person. Well, first, the entire concept of being a better person because of this is derived from that perspective purely. It's kind of it's kind of like somebody who's been raised to believe that red is their favorite color, telling you that red is their favorite color. They never had a choice in the matter. There was never an opportunity for them to think anything else. They just have this one go-to answer. And the struggle then comes down to this, is that when we come to Christ, the first thing that we do is lay down our life. We die to ourself in order to be reborn. How how does one maintain a death of identity and character, but also control every facet of life afterwards? You're being rebuilt from the ground up on a spiritual, psychological, and sometimes even physical nature. How will you control that when it's meant to be something done by another being? And therein lies our first, big hurdle in relationship with God. Because God is meant to be God. In John 1, flipping through the Bible real fast. I had no scriptures set out for today, beforehand. In John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Talking about John the Baptist. Skipping down to verse 9. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor a human decision, nor a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Out of his fullness, we've all received grace in place of Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God, and is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. When he talks about Jesus in this respect, he exemplifies his character, but more than anything, it's just this reality of who he was and who he came as. And being the first and having all creation made through him. If all creation was made through him, and he gives us, it's Jesus who gives us the ability to become the children, to be reborn. It's not going to happen through our own will. You can't just deconstruct yourself and then become a new person. Oftentimes the process of deconstruction ends up developing a tendency to see things a different way, but it may not necessarily create a new person. You'll still carry a lot of the same characteristics. You'll still carry a lot of the same flaws. The Holy Spirit changes everything. That's why when Paul outlines the fruit of the Holy Spirit, there are so many different facets of it. And it's also why it ends up being so problematic that a lot of us will look at it as a list of commands. Because there are emotional changes that you can't just make happen. You can justify loving other people to yourself, but you can't make yourself love people. You can say, well, I've come to terms with them, I've made peace with the idea of them, I've accepted them, but it doesn't mean that you love them. Love is one of the fruits of the Spirit. Peace is one of the fruits of the Spirit. You can do a lot of things to try to make yourself feel more peaceful, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have peace. And that ends up being the point, is that so much of this comes through Jesus, just like that. You find a situation where the whole world was created through him, by him, and in this particular case, he's the one who commands it. He's the one who offers the grace, offers the transformation, and is the one pushing it through. To give up control is absolutely necessary. So even with that, though, and I can say this from experience, sometimes for controlling people, that becomes another thing that you try to control. I am going to give up everything. I'm going to actively give up everything to Jesus. I have fallen into that trap myself in the past, where it became a thing out of my own power that I was going to give up everything and be saved. Because it has to come with surrender. And that's really hard. That's really, really hard. It's not just giving up your life hard. It's giving up your life, your comfort, everything about it. Everything that you can contrive as what makes things right has to be given up in that instance.
Recently I was praying about something, trying to figure out something, and God didn't tell me what I was trying to figure out, but he did tell me to surrender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because yeah. Yeah. I know there's this song that I was actually singing in the tub last night, but it was called Surrender. And when it first came on, I was just like, oh, that's hitting some spots right now, isn't it? Yeah. Because see, the thing about it is that for controlling people, or religious people as well, the struggle with this ends up being a little deeper, this surrender part, because your very idea of what is contrite, what is good, has to be thrown out and surrendered as well to be reconfigured. Because statements like cleanliness is next to godliness, for example, that's not real. That is purely something that somebody made up. That's not in the Bible. As such, and a lot of people have like a lot of, especially religious ones, have like cherry-picked verses that they will use to justify their viewpoint. And it's like, well, what if you read that in context? Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't matter. It's the Bible. You can pick whatever you want. It's like, that's also not true. That's like heretical in everything. Mm-hmm. And as such, it becomes a thing that you have to fight with. And it's a must. This is not a may effect. This isn't a kind of thing where Jesus is like, hey, can you please like give this up? Can you please like surrender this to me so that I can be king of your life? No, you have to do this in order to have salvation. You have to do this in order to have me as king of your life. There can't be two kings in your life. There can only be one. And it has to be me. Because the reality of what happens if you don't, is mortifying. When you have just wanton control and religion, you get horrifying stories. And I mean, like, for example, these are literally just ones that I came across this week as I was like preparing for the message, and each one I didn't understand why until now, like right now. One of them is in terms of control, it just control itself without religious connotation. One of the stories that I came across was a story from, like Victorian era France, roughly. Like photographs had just become a thing. And there was this family, and I can't remember the names, but there was this family and one of the girls who was renowned for her beauty. And, she was legitimately stunning. Like, there were pictures of her with early photography being a thing. But this family was a collection of French aristocrats. And the girl fell in love with a guy who was not of any name. He wasn't noble, he wasn't an aristocrat, he wasn't a socialite, he wasn't anything. He was just I can't remember what he did for a job, but he was lowborn, as they would call him, or as her mom called him. But she loved him. And she really wanted to, have that relationship. So mom, in an effort to control her daughter, locked her daughter in her room and tied her to the bed. Chained her, I should say, for 43 years.
Oh, man.
Or was it 27? Either way, it was a long, long time. No, that's right. She was 43 when she came out. It was something like 27 years that she was in there. This girl was trapped in her room for 2 decades. And when they found her, and they would feed her, but they wouldn't clean up anything. They wouldn't let her out to go to the bathroom. They blocked all the windows. So this poor woman sat in her room, chained to her bed, for 2 decades. Her only company was rats. And her mom felt completely justified to do this because it's what she needed to do in order to control her daughter's behavior. It was an anonymous tip to the police that led them to finally find her. They came in, they checked the room, they checked the house, they found one room that smelled particularly awful. They popped it open, found no windows and just the smell and the chatter of rats. They had to break open the window, and they found this girl. And unfortunately, she had to spend the rest of her life living in a sanitarium because she was so mentally damaged by this, as one would be. She had lived for 2 decades in complete isolation, in a dark room. No windows, no nothing, just her alone. And she wasn't okay. The mom and her brother were the 2 culprits who were found. The brother would lie and claim that she had run off. He knew. I believe he was deemed mentally unstable himself, and then mom died of a heart attack like 2 weeks before she stood trial or something like that. But it's like the levels of what happens, what people can get up to on the grounds of maintaining what they feel they need in terms of control. Another story that I was drawn to was particularly in the religious vein. There was a sect of Russian monks known as the White Doves. They had another name, but I can't pronounce it, speaking of linguistics. But the name translated to White Doves. I think they originally started in Hungary or Romania. Yes, and then they were moved to Siberia after Stalin took power. But the thing about it was that the White Doves were a community of hermits, or of monks specifically, and they were all eunuchs. See, they believed that in order to control their bodies, they had to remain sexually pure, but not just that they had to take the most extreme ways in order to maintain their sexual purity, which involved the men making themselves into eunuchs by castrating themselves to some level or another. And they called it the holy mark. There was the lesser holy mark, and there was the greater holy mark, and which of those you had depended on how much of your genitalia you surrendered, as it were. You gave up in order to maintain your purity. And it wasn't just men. The women would also mutilate their breasts and genitalia in order to make themselves unable to have sex, or to make themselves undesirable, as it were. Effectively, what you find is that, see, in these stories, and these are extreme cases, but the reality of it is that what many of us have found in interacting with people who had strong control issues, or strong religious issues, or strong religious or controlling spirits attached to them, this isn't far off from what some of us have witnessed or experienced in relation to those kinds of people, especially once you start getting the spirits involved. See, having the issues is one thing, but once you have a demon creep onto the scene and start influencing those decisions and creating justifications for why you should behave in such a way or do such a thing, you start destroying things in order to maintain that control. See, demons have no remorse. All that they're interested in is destroying us, and making us destroy others. It's almost, I've talked about it in the past, but it's this concept of taking what is God's creation and bears his image and destroying it, and especially making it hurt each other, where we become the instruments of our own destruction. And they revel in that. Hey God, look what your kids are doing to each other. Look at, they bear little yous and they're all killing each other and hurting each other. They delight in that. They relish it. And the reality is that control spirits are some of the most sadistic in what they will do. They are insidious in their capacity to fool us into believing that what we are doing is just. We talked during the shame messages about like Satan's strongest lies are the ones that he makes sound virtuous. These guys also have a gift for that. They will provide you the opportunity to maintain control of your situation, and at the same time they'll make it sound right. You have to do this because it will protect your family. You have to protect your family. You have to do this in order to protect your family. You have to do this to protect yourself. You have to do this to keep everything in the order that you have it in, because what's more important than the order that you have things in? Don't allow this thing to happen. You have to be right before God, right? And the thing about it is they are not shy about using, in the case of the ones who attack us in religion, they'll use the Bible against you. Like, that's why that verse ends up being important to remember, that Jesus brought us a new grace in contrast to what the law offered. He offered us grace. He brought salvation. And remembering that's important, because the law can be used as a tool against us, just like it was used against Jesus. He didn't rebuke the Pharisees for being like good followers of God. He rebuked them for being overly righteous, among other things. But I'm thinking more about Matthew 23, where he rebukes them for tithing their spices, where he rebukes them for the way that they would make other people emulate them, but in truth putting their burdens on them. He rebukes them so heavily because their religiousness was actually a point of destruction. And they turned that around on him and, well, killed him. And this is the reality that we all have to kind of acknowledge, is that these spirits lead to death for us and for those around us. When they start getting involved, they're the ones who create the scenarios where those Matthew 7 scenarios where you have people saying, Lord, Lord, look at all the things I did in your name. I cast out demons, I did this, and Jesus is like, I never knew you. They are the locus by which that circumstance is created, because they will take us down those roads. I have met Christians who, they'll use the argument that they felt peace about something. I always have a problem with people saying that they felt peace about something, because I've seen Christians feel peace about horrifying things. Legitimately horrifying things. And it's just been, it's jaw-dropping at times to have to like witness it. But in the end, it breathes death, because you find yourself, especially if you're on the receiving end of those things they had peace about, you'll very quickly find resentment for the church. And in this way, it creates a circumstance where now there is a situation where not just is this person finding death, but they're creating death for the greater community as they're driving people from the church, as they're driving people from the community. That's why Karens are a meme that's reviled, because they all have that controlling, the people who that represents, truly, they have that same controlling spirit and aspect. See, I was, in preparation for this message, one of the things that God had me do was watch an episode of Star Trek, of all things. And it was specifically the episode called The Skin of Evil. Like I said, I was going to come back to the Star Trek thing after my incidental Klingon pun. The thing that happened, though, in that story, like, TLDR is one of their shuttles crash lands on a planet, and the planet happens to have a monster on it, this black tar creature that's apparently created from some alien race sloughing off all their evil and corruptness into one being, and there he was. And he wanted to hurt people. He trapped one of the crew in that, or two of the crew members in that crash shuttle, and then wouldn't let anybody come to help him. And then, he killed one of the crewmen and tormented the others, and then when they would leave, he would go and sit over the shuttle and harass the people inside, the person that was conscious inside, and try to torment her too. And the whole thing, the premise of it all was simply this, that he wanted to hurt people because he wanted them himself to be amused. He tried to control them in various ways at many different points, trying to turn them on each other for his amusement, trying to force them to act the way he wanted them to act. And in many ways, this is how these spirits are. They're violent, they're cruel. And it's a thing too, like, they will not hesitate to provide you an outlet for violence. They will go that far. These two stories as examples, the white doves and the French family, these are both examples where truly terrible things were done. Like the white doves did it to themselves, sure. But at the same time, they took what was beautiful and God's created and they mutilated it, all because they believed that would make them more righteous. And then, they're extinct now. Stalin, when he took power in Russia, in the USSR, he moved them to Siberia, forced them to move to Siberia. And then through his various occasions of scapegoating them, eventually wiped them out. It also doesn't help that they weren't building their community in any physical means. So
yeah,
they all went extinct, as it were, to my knowledge, anyways. But the other things, I mean, I don't know. I could tell horror stories from social workers and so on that I've met and known, where you find that the other stories are not. None of these stories are far from what happens in real life now. Mm-hmm. Cops and social workers, two kinds of people that you can have conversations with and walk away with a very, very different perspective on people around you. But the thing of it is that the spirit was acting in such a way, or rather this being was acting in such a way on the show. And what was interesting was the way that they chose to overcome it. The person in the shuttle was the ship's counselor, and she kept talking to him, and every time he would come at her and try to torment her, or manipulate her, she would respond by just talking him through to find out what was going on, what his story was. And then when the captain finally got to go talk to her, she gave him everything she knew. And the captain turned around to use that to effectively diminish his power. And I thought that was interesting because it's very apt. Part of this is about being free of these controlling spirits and mindsets. Here's what it is. Here's the horror that it can inflict. Here's how we become free. The biggest and most important thing for a person who's struggling with control is to ask why they need control. Why is it so important? Because you're never going to score points with God by being hyper-controlling. I mean, as an example, when Jesus was sitting with Mary and Martha, He had a gentle rebuke for Martha when she got mad at Mary for hanging out with Jesus instead of helping with get things ready for the party. And Jesus was just like, this is where she's supposed to be. Well, Martha ran ahead and took care of tried to get everything taken care of. Jesus had more appreciation for Mary being right where she was. And that was close to him. So our grandiose efforts don't really win us any points with Christ. Because again, Jesus' prerogative is our hearts. And there can only be one king in our lives, and it has to be him. If we are Christians, if we are truly religious, then all of who we are gets surrendered and gets baptized in holy fire and renewed. But that's hard to do when you like and are comfortable with who you are. The thing about it is what is it that you like? What is so important? What is worth holding on to? What do you have that would make you stand before Jesus and say, I need to be this person? And do you really need that? Do you really need to be that person? Is it absolutely a must? And if you can't imagine a world where you don't have control of everything in your life, that's a red flag. Because the thing about it is the truth of human life, as kind of highlighted last week, we talked about how some things are beyond our control. The decisions of other people, the weather, so many different things are not in our control. And we have to learn to accept that. And if we can't, well, we have to do it anyways. Because it's required for us to continue to function as human beings in this world that we don't have complete control over. Otherwise, we will just drive ourselves insane with our need to control everything that can't be satiated. I play competitive card games on a routine basis. I mean, we're sitting in the shop where we sell the Magic cards and Flesh and Blood and Pokemon and everything. And I have to routinely explain to people when they get mad at because their decks didn't work or whatever, they'll turn on themselves. And it's bewildering to watch because I used to do it myself when I first started, until I had to face the reality that it's a card game. You shuffle your deck, and whatever you draw is what you have to play with. And sometimes what you draw is awful, and there is no playing with it, there's just losing with it. But that's not your fault. You didn't mess up. It's just the cards that were dealt to you. And that's okay. Sometimes you get a losing hand. And that's what you're stuck with. I personally think it's kind of a great growing experience for so many people who have control issues to play games like that, where you don't have complete control over everything, and you have to learn to accept that in order to not throw temper tantrums and get looked at like a baby. It helps in a way. It's a safe way to kind of come to terms with the reality of of accepting that you can't control everything, even if it's Uno.
I think jumping back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about aspects of yourself that you like, it seems like the opposite can be true as well, where if there's aspects of yourself that you really don't like, that can be also very difficult to surrender, because of that constant drive and felt need to change that thing at whatever cost.
Yeah.
To make it into something that you do like.
Oh yeah. Well, we'll get there in just a moment.
Okay.
Yeah. So the thing about it is that, like, I think it's important for people to have these kinds of outlets where they can kind of experience not having complete control and being able to be okay with it. But the reality is no matter how we get there, we have to get there. Because when there are things that we like, they tend to be so hard for us to let go because we enjoy them. There are many people who enjoy the sense of control that they have over their lives, whether it's through their own discipline or through yelling at people's managers until they get what they want. I remember my mom, like, in particular. She's not really what would be justified as like a Karen, but her advice to me oftentimes was just annoy people till you get what you want. And I was just like, every time I'm like, that sounds really tedious. And she's like, but it works. Oh, she wasn't wrong. I don't like it, but she wasn't wrong. And the thing that would happen all the time with it was that, like, I'd watch her do it, and it would work. And then when I tried it, it didn't work. I was trying to get a job at the zoo, and after a year of me sending a message every day, sending an application every day, they finally just sent me a letter and were like, "We have received your application, stop sending them." And I'm like, dang it.
Oh, no.
So the thing is just like, some people like that. They like that feeling of power. They feel empowered by their own ability to do stuff, but that's something we have to surrender in order to follow Jesus, because when we're reveling in our own power, we're just reveling in ourselves. It doesn't matter who we claim to worship or not. We're still just worshiping ourselves at that point. Again, you can only have one master, one king. Now, to your point about things that we don't like about ourselves, this can be just as much an enormous cause for control issues. Because as you put very well, sometimes that can be a huge motivating force for people to just push further and further into trying to gain control. Self-hatred is one of the most complete reasons for people to become controlling, to become religious. And the worst part is, in both cases, they validate that self-hatred. See, the same verses that are meant to bring conviction can also be twisted to bring shame. And shame will drive people to want to know, as they don't want to feel it. It will drive them so hard into needing to change, needing to be different, needing to have control over themselves and who they are in such a way that they will do anything and fight whatever battle they have to in order to get it. And the reality of it all is that those people, in truth, can be the most blind, because they believe it's virtuous and righteous that they're trying to change who they are, because they need to. I can't go to heaven if I have sin in my life, so I must remove all sin from my life. And that's when they create a new form of sin, unintentionally. That's where they fall into things like pride, and they become self-destructive. In the case of our white doves, they hated lust, and they hated the fact that they could be compelled by lust. And in the dream of acquiring freedom from that sin, as it were, they removed the problem in the most self-destructive way that they could. And they probably never struggled with lust again, at least not the men. But at the same time, they also couldn't, it was also a violation of their own persons and God's creation. All they did was manifest self-hatred. In the pursuit of righteousness. I will tell you in a way that I've never quite put it, it is not righteous to hate ourselves. Point blank. Because Jesus doesn't hate us. It is not virtuous or righteous to hate what God has created. In fact, it is a sin. Instead, we need to be able to come to terms with these things. Because see, as I stated, with the thing he gave me to look at there, because it had to be Star Trek, the way they defeated this monster was to make it face its own loneliness. Its hatred was so much, it was so easy for it to stay there and to justify trying to control them and hurt them and so many different things. It was when they made it face its loneliness and its own struggle with rejection, that's when its power was diminished. It's not different with this. Facing the reality of why we need control is the first step to freedom from control. It allows us to finally be able to look at it and say, I can let this go. Or not. At which point there's we could do a whole other message on the I don't want to change part. But the reality is that we have to. We have to change. Or rather, to put it in a way that can't be twisted to be used in an effort to control one, we have to allow ourselves to be changed by the Holy Spirit as God does the work that he intends to do in our hearts and souls to make us new people. It's a must. Our salvation hinges on it. You can believe any number of virtuous lies that you want. You can grab whatever scriptures that you want in order to try to twist this. But the truth of the matter is that grace is God's to give. The Holy Spirit saves. We don't save ourselves. Jesus saves us. He died on the cross for us. The Holy Spirit was given for us. And that is our salvation. We need to reject who we are, to lay that out, to be redeemed. And reject doesn't mean hate in this instance. It means simply to say, I need to be different. And to lay out who we are before God and say, please change this. Change what you will. Because the truth is, God might not change everything. All of us are still carrying parts of God that he loves. And he loves that we carry them. So when we die to ourselves, sometimes there are parts that get carried forward. You might have innately just a compassion for people that just drives you. And God will take that and he might just galvanize it, make it stronger. Because that's something from him. A place where you are showing that image, as it were. But in the end, control has to be relinquished and we have to lay out to him what is his, and that's us and our hearts and souls. And when we say that we give our everything to him, we have to actually do it, and then see what happens. And the fact that that's hard to do is okay. It's not a point of shame. It's a point of being human. Especially when you got influencers that are in a spiritual form. It's okay to struggle with that when you have demons that are trying to push you one direction or another. Struggling is okay. Choosing blindness, choosing death is not. But that's what I've got.